So tonight's kind of a special guest, at least for me. I think I've told at least my class. This is Greg Meyer. He was actually my CEO at NASA Sponsored Classroom of the Future, and then I was his CEO at Physiogenics. So it was very interesting. Yes, and so we're still talking, so I think that's a good thing. But we haven't seen each other in a little while, so I think we talked a little too much tonight. So we'll get going. I'm going to actually read off. It's kind of funny. I've known Greg, we've been 10 years?
12 years.
Okay. I've known him 10 years, but his list is so impressive that I actually have to read it because my memory is not that good. Very accomplished entrepreneur. I would say that probably in southeast Wisconsin, if not the state of Wisconsin, he has been involved in more startups, more scale-ups, from software, medical device, healthcare, just about every field than probably any other individual. So a wealth of knowledge. So he's going to talk about innovation tonight. Listen to that and then ask questions. I mean, this is a rare opportunity to really tap into a true entrepreneur. So some of his background. Oh, you said you're the 21st student. Who, did you write this or did we?
I don't know, someone else wrote it and I copied it.
Greg
I think I found it on LinkedIn.
Okay, Greg is a pioneer in the 21st century of innovation. It says hundreds of startups, literally hundreds of startups. An early stage, he's been a founder, a mentor, a teacher. I know for me, most of my lessons in leadership came from him. He's also worked at multiple companies. And it's been, the reason I really invited him here is because I'm a big believer in servant leadership. And so all of this that he's done, there's always been something of social and giving back, much before social entrepreneur was really ever kind of a hipster term. Greg was already doing it. So he's worked at Vet Transfer, where he was working with veterans to get them startup companies. He worked at a great company called Physiogenics, which did drug development.
Great leadership.
That's right. He's been on the board. I was going to read all this, but it's too long. Other things that I should tell him about you. Well, I guess he went to Madison, and he's originally trained as a lawyer. So
I escaped. I'll talk a little about that.
yes, recovering lawyer. Probably one of the smarter people that I've ever met. Whether you're talking about history, whether you're talking about business, or just politics or theology. So it's a real pleasure to have him here today. And then in all honesty, I do encourage you, ask him all sorts of questions. Matter of fact, you can ask him during his presentation and throw him off of his presentation.
Which will easily happen.
Right. So, I guess with that, we'll get
Yeah, thanks, Brian, very much. So, and always embarrassing, especially from Wisconsin, because you got to maintain a level of humility, which is important. So, I just want to talk. I'm going to talk about innovation in general. Oops, I jumped like 10 slides ahead. Talk about innovation in general, some of the work I've done and things of that sort, any questions you have, or like Brian said, if you want to go off on different tangents around entrepreneurship and things of that sort. But I want to start kind of with some of the things I'm working on today and things that kind of interest me, and then give some background over maybe the last 8 years or so, which have been a pretty busy period of time. So one of my big areas of interest is the use of virtual reality in healthcare, especially for those with disabilities and things of that sort. So we worked with the Northwestern Mutual Foundation to build a virtual reality mobile game for kids with cancer. We partnered with the Ronald McDonald House. This is a short video clip, but it'll help tell some of the story of what we worked on. So the challenge that was presented to us, and there's a lot of research coming out around VR, both is pain reduction. Our work was on distraction therapy. And the question was, could we distract the kids between home and chemotherapy and things of that sort? So it presented a lot of technical challenges. We spent a bunch of time with the kids at the Ronald McDonald House, worked with Children's Hospital. But most of the kids are there because they're of lower means. So working in mobile VR on basically lower end phones was one of the challenges. So we had challenges from physics and all kinds of things. But the idea was to provide these kids some sort of distraction from what was happening around them. And then the game, myself and another guy, we wrote a big chunk of the code. Originally we did it with Bluetooth controller, because right there on IV and all that kind of stuff, to make it hands-free. And we shipped about a month ago to 10 hospitals as part of a kind of a virtual camp for kids. So this is kind of one of my big areas of interest now, is the application of virtual reality to help people. The other thing I've been spending a bunch of time on is with a group here in Milwaukee called Young Enterprising Society. So I worked with these guys for about a handful of years now. So we created a STEM program for kids in the inner city with summer camp and things of that sort. Work with schools like St. John's Atita, like 17 different high schools and middle schools here in the city. And then this year, just this summer, we launched an inner city accelerator. I'll talk about accelerators here in a second. We're in the process of the first cohort. I taught last weekend the cohort, and they'll have what we call their demo day here in a few weeks. But the idea is to drive enterprise into the inner city and to teach the best practices to folks in the inner city, along with teaching the next generation about technology and programming and things of that sort. And I mix up these slides and I jump all over the place, which is kind of my nature. So in 2000, right, the dot-com bubble explodes, and out of that comes a very significant period of time where we've learned more about entrepreneurship, how to do it, and what it means to the world than we've ever known before. And it's changed how we do entrepreneurship, how we start businesses, and how we understand just how important entrepreneurship is. This is a little timeline to tell here at the beginning of my story. So 2010, we'll start the first accelerator in Wisconsin, 94 Labs. Myself and another guy will help fund and start 26 new software companies here in Wisconsin, predominantly coming out of the universities. At the same time, Alexander Osterwalder had published his book, Business Model Generation. So we started one of the first groups, probably the first group in Wisconsin, to integrate both Alexander's work and Steve Blank's work. So we started with the customer development methodology and Alexander's work. We'd go on at that same year. I'd start 2 more companies. One is still going strong in the healthcare space. One, as far as I know, is one of the first to be selected in the innovation category at South by Southwest. I also wrote a grant with 2 other people to the Department of Veterans Affairs, which Brian had mentioned, a $2.4 million grant. Obama had brought in kind of the grand challenge model that Peter Diamandis and others had developed with XPRIZE into all the agencies, and we'd been selected under one of the grand challenges at the federal government level. And so the accelerator started, we had that grant, and then in 2012, a bunch of things went out to Berkeley and was part of Steve Blank's first class. We started teaching other people to teach the customer methodology. And then that year, the Obama administration had 2 groups. He had his Presidential Champions of Change and Presidential Innovation Fellows. We were basically nominated and selected as Presidential Champions of Change. So I would make 7 more trips out to the White House after that, and we'd collaborate on a bunch of different projects. As Brian mentioned, our focus in what we'd won the Grand Challenge on was helping veterans who were so severely disabled that their only option was to do self-employment entrepreneurship. So that's where I'd spent several years, was working with these folks and designing processes and programs to help them. Which ultimately brings Brian and I together in one of our projects. So I end up on this kind of unusual path in a most unusual way. So I was living the American dream. I was a partner in a large law firm. I had a BMW. I had custom-made suits. I had expensive pens and watches. I worked 7 days a week. I had no life, and I hated the world. So the American dream. And then one of my clients says to me, he's like, you know, I'm volunteering at this group down in the inner city, 6th and Washington, the old St. Pat's convent down there. He says, I think you could be helpful there. So I went down one day and visited, and I was blown away. I happened to get there at the time that they have these big prayer circles where everyone would pray together. And these kids were from every possible background imaginable. And it moved me in a way I couldn't have expected. And so I started going down there more and more and more. And then finally, one of the senior partners called me into his office and he said, Greg, what is the firm going to get out of this? And I said to him, which you'll see that I tend to get myself in a lot of trouble. I said to him, eternal salvation. And he didn't find that incredibly funny, but it also answered a big question for me, which is what I need to do with my life going forward. One thing Brother Holub would teach me when we were driving back one time, we were driving back past where Homeboys was, which was the name of the group, and he said, may we again find such meaningful work. So I've made that kind of my challenge to myself, whether it be working with kids with cancer, working in the inner city, is that my work have meaning to it and meaning to me and meaning to the world. And so it was through this that I left the practice of law. I've never gone back. And then I've done all kinds of things, including all kinds of stuff with Brian, startups. I've spent about half my time on the commercial side, half on the social entrepreneurship side. So I've thrown in some quotes that I've liked over time, but basically I chose a different path. Like I said, I was doing the traditional thing. I'd gone undergrad Madison, law school Madison, got a job as a lawyer, worked my way up, and then start asking those questions, is this all there's going to be? And then I found a path that took me a bunch of different directions over time. So now I want to talk a little bit about innovation itself. So this presentation I'd originally put together, not this exact one, but a variation of this for the economic leadership of the British government. Hence why the slide still has the British GDP growth rate. So this particular work, the work of Angus Maddison, a British economist, almost leads every book on innovation today. And what Angus did is he looked back to the time of Christ forward and said, what happened in GDP around the world? And what he found is absolutely nothing. GDP at best grew 6% per century for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then something strange happened. Oh, I don't know why the bottom's not showing up. Oh, I know, I put it in slide mode. There, now we have some dates across the bottom. And then something strange happened, and you can't see it in this graph, but in kind of the mid to late 1700s, all of a sudden, GDP starts to grow faster, right? We have the first industrial revolution. And then by the late 1870s or so, the second industrial revolution, and we'd seen something that the world had never witnessed, which was GDP growing 5, 6, 10% per year. Literally, the world changed. Everything we know about the world changed, right? Lighting, heating, the fact that we're not going out chopping wood to stay warm in the winter in Wisconsin. All of this changed beginning in like the 1870s. So an American economist, William Baumol, will look at this and he'll say that about 92% of this growth that we saw, unprecedented in the history of humankind, was attributable to something called innovation. And that's why people are so fascinated by innovation. This thing we call innovation is what's driven everything we know about the world today. If you look at like the UN statistics about their goals of reducing extreme poverty around the world, they were way ahead of schedule. And they keep being ahead of schedule because we keep innovating and raising the wealth of the world and the people around the world. And so this thing, innovation, is fascinating in so many ways. So because so many people use the word innovation now, it's all over the place, I use a very kind of traditional, simple approach, which is that innovation basically equates to sort of economic value or economic growth. So in effect, and this will play out when I talk about our processes that we use today, is that something's invented, and then we entrepreneurs wrap a business model around it and take it to market and create value. This is the big change. Abraham Lincoln would write about this, right? Historically, things like the steam engine and stuff had been invented thousands of years before, but no one ever thought about applying it. It was just a toy. And then for some reason, all these forces came together, and these people that we call entrepreneurs start wrapping business models around these inventions and literally change everything about the world. And they still do it today, right? We read about them all the time. And kind of jump around on topics here. So in innovation, this building, which looks like a giant shack, it's like a block long, called Building 20. So Building 20 was built at the end of World War II as a radiation lab, right? So no materials available, only scrap lumber, the thing's thrown together. It's meant to be torn down right after World War II. It stays up for another 50 years and becomes one of the most innovative places in the history of the world. 9 Nobel Prizes will emanate from there. At one time, 20% of the physicists in the United States reside there. Noam Chomsky develops linguistics there. Bose develops his eponymous speakers there. All of this happens in this building, this disaster of a building. And we'll talk a little bit about some theory a little bit later, but part of it is the building attracted a lot of crazy, smart, innovative people because the rules of MIT didn't apply there. You could knock down walls, you could run wires through floors. No one cared about this building because it was scheduled to be torn down. And so people who wanted a lot of freedom to create all aggregated in this place. So the rules of innovation are really this. It's all about the people. It's not the building, the space. It's about the people and giving them freedom to create. And that's the story of innovation. I put kindergarten here because it's interesting. The British led the first industrial revolution. They crushed it. But they fell behind Germany and the United States in the second industrial revolution. And part of the reason why is that the British could not stop exploiting children. The Germans and the Americans started educating their children. And so, believe it or not, this is Mrs. Meyer, an immigrant from Bremen, Germany, comes here to the States. And the first kindergarten in the United States is started in Wisconsin. We actually start educating our kids from the earliest ages forward. And lo and behold, the next industrial revolution, everything since, has been driven by brain power over time, more and more. And this is what allowed the US and Germany to accelerate beyond where prior groups have done in innovation. This is, I do this from Milwaukee. This is the story of the beginning and the end of innovation in Milwaukee. So Milwaukee struggled for a long time to get back on track. So the reason why we had tremendous innovation in Milwaukee, right? I mean, this at one time was like literally the Silicon Valley of the machine age. If you're a lawyer, we have tons of patent attorneys here because we invented so much stuff in Milwaukee during the industrial age. And that was driven by a group called the 48ers from Europe. So these people in Europe, they basically completely disorganized, but particularly in Germany, in German-speaking countries, want to overthrow the monarchs. They wanted private rights, and most of them were exiled out. So a bunch of basically well-off, highly educated people, a lot of engineers, came to Milwaukee, starting in like 58, 68, right around the beginning of the second industrial revolution. And so we'll see companies like Johnson Controls, I think starts like in the 1870s. All these companies start as these mass immigration of people come from Europe. And a lot of them happen to have engineering technical skills. So we fast forward to 1958, almost 100 years later. And so Milwaukee has been incredibly successful industrial-wise. And there's a guy named Jack Kilby. So Jack graduated from UWM with a master's in electrical engineering. He's working at a place called Central Labs down in the kind of Fifth Ward area, down in Walker's Point. And Jack becomes interested in miniaturized circuits. And so he's going out to this place called Bell Labs. And he's really interested in this stuff. And a memo comes down from the leadership of Central Labs saying, we're not interested in this miniaturization of circuit stuff. We're killing all the projects. That spring of 58, Jack leaves for Texas. He goes to a startup down there called Texas Instruments. And because he was a new employee, this is his lab book from June 12, 1958. In this lab book, Jack Kilby will sketch the integrated circuit for which he'll win the Nobel Prize, and he'll kick off the entire, basically, technology industry of today. He was in Milwaukee just a few months before that. We stopped funding our innovative people. Remember, it's all about people and supporting those people, those innovative people. And so this is a story of a bunch of immigrants coming who had skills, who did a bunch of things, and then eventually we lost our way and we stopped funding our innovative people, and guys like Jack left and took the entire future silicon industry and everything else with them. right? Milwaukee was the place it should have been. Oh, I put this up there because I sometimes get in trouble for using the progressive word. Go back to 48. So, right, the abolitionist movement becomes a big deal in this part of the country. The Republican Party started in Wisconsin, which at the time was a very different party. This is fascinating to me. So if you go up onto Cathedral Square, Wisconsin was the only state in the Union to declare unconstitutional the Fugitive Slave Act. So if you look at this, basically a bunch of Wisconsin people, 5,000 people, imagine this before social media and everything, gathered to protect a fugitive slave and then help him get to Canada. So if you go back in time, if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 1860s, 70s, 80s, this was a very progressive place, right? This was the Portland, Seattle, but on scale where people are willing to even sacrifice their lives for kind of these values and belief systems. So this is kind of the history of Milwaukee in its heyday, in the birth of when we were a major innovative player. Oops. So kind of shift topics here. So since 1972 approximately, right, we've talked about wage stagnation and all these other things. I put this in there because it's also kind of the point of emergence of disco. So you could say disco killed innovation in a broad sense, but people start looking at 72 forward and realize that we lived in a very extraordinary time from the Second Industrial Revolution to about 1972, when basically wage stagnation started, disparity in income, so forth and so on. And this is interesting, two pieces. Bill Gross, very famous bond manager, would estimate in 2006 that we needed $20 of debt to produce $1 of GDP growth. So if I look at today, we're going to generate about $1 trillion in deficit, and let's say multiple trillion in consumer debt and other things, to push about 3% in GDP growth. So the question starts to arise. And then, of course, the famous Han Solo, he looks around and says, computer age is everywhere, but in the productivity numbers, right? So productivity numbers are heavily tied to growth and wage increases and all that stuff. And for some reason, in that period of time, it seemed like innovation stopped having an impact on GDP. So a bunch of books have come out and other things that we're reverting back to the mean. Remember Angus Madison, 6% per century. We have this incredible period of time. And so it's these kind of things that are driving the tremendous discussion, the interest by corporations and everyone else in innovation. Communities, it's that basically growth is slowed down. Without a huge amount of debt, we don't see much growth anymore in the developed countries. In China, this is written by Larry Summers, a report, also is reverting to the mean, and their debt ramp is like this now to keep the growth rate continuing forward. So these are some headwinds that exist today. Educational attainment cost, aging population. One that I'm fascinated by, which I do keep a foot in working on, and it's a great book. So it's Baumol's Cost of Disease. So he was the economist who interpreted Angus Madison's work. But Baumol's Cost of Disease is interesting because when he was a grad student, he looked around and said, boy, things that are labor intensive, they don't scale very well. And their cost goes up and up. And so a long time ago, he recognized that this would be a problem in healthcare. So our challenges in healthcare are fascinating when you read it in context of Baumol's challenge of the actual labor intensity of delivering healthcare today. So Peter Thiel said many things, but this one's fascinating. So those who are out and doing innovation, entrepreneurship, and all those kind of things, we feel like things are going really fast today. And they are. But the difference is they're having very little impact. So what drove the Second Industrial Revolution were two general purpose technologies, electricity and the internal combustion engine. Nothing has matched scale since that time. So we're going really fast. We're not moving in any big direction today. So this remains a challenge. Taken from first biology and then into economics, the Red Queen's race from Alice in Wonderland, is that we're basically going faster and faster to get nowhere. And so these are the challenges that we're presented with today in the world is how do we drive innovation? How can we get ourselves back on this track of driving big technologies, big ideas. My opinion, and as Brian mentioned, worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, see a lot of stuff. I think we're doing too many small things. I see way too many small ideas coming forward. We're not pushing big ideas anymore, and I think that's one of the things we got to get back to. On the flip side, where Gordon and these guys are pretty pessimistic, Keynes would write this in the height of the Depression, that I don't think it's the end of the world, right, folks? Things are slowing down, but it's not the end, right? Even 2% growth is a big deal on the size of numbers we're talking about. But at the end of the day, optimism, I think, will drive us forward. But I think we got to push toward much bigger solutions and bigger ideas. So what's next? This is something and a lot of people think about this. I think your generation is going to ask the question, what comes after growth? What other than GDP can we do? Right? We've measured everything for the last 100 plus years, everything we do around GDP and growth. Wendell Berry's one of my favorite writers. And so what can we do going forward? Can we make this a more just world? Can we completely eliminate poverty and things of that sort? So I think your generation is going to ask a different set of questions. We've been so focused on nothing but growth for over 100 years. And now we've kept whatever growth we've had going by just debt. But we have tremendous wealth in the world. So I think you guys are going to have to rethink kind of what happens after a growth focus era. So this is brief. So we have people that work in businesses today. I can go on any different set of topics. Anyone here work in a company today? Yeah? Raise hands. Oh, you can admit it. I escaped from a law firm. So this is something that comes at a bunch of different angles and comes back to a bunch of thoughts. Anyone know Herbert Simon? Probably the smartest person ever to come from Milwaukee. So Herbert Simon won the Nobel Prize in Economics, the Turing Award in Artificial Intelligence, was an expert in 6 topics, published over 1,000 papers. Anyone hear of design thinking? Really? Oops. All right. Well, Herbert Simon in Sciences of the Artificial would actually create the field of design thinking. So you guys ever heard of IDEO? Stanford? D-School? So design thinking basically is the process of how we create artifacts, how we create things, that chair, how do we design these things? And it's a big deal. At Google, they have the Google Design Sprint process. Jason Knapp and these guys developed. So design thinking is interrelated to some of the work that we do on the entrepreneurship side. Herbert, in one of his last papers, would basically define entrepreneurship vis-a-vis business thinking as, if you look at someone going into the kitchen, a business person has a recipe and all the ingredients laid out. And they execute on that recipe, and they do it really well. We train some of the best business people in the world in execution. And I'll talk about Steve Blank's work here in a second. But entrepreneurs, they walk in the kitchen, open the fridge, and whatever is there, they make something. It's a whole different way of seeing the world, and people use it with artists and how different people approach things, but different ways of thinking. The last part, which goes back to Building 20, which is a little more complicated, but their theory of near decomposability. So this is why corporations can't innovate, or one of the reasons why, there's many reasons, is that in effect, to innovate as a corporation, you need to create something external to the company. Building 20 existed outside the rules of MIT. So corporations, in effect, to innovate would have to do the same thing. The idea of near decomposability is it's outside, but close enough that the corporations can learn from what's going on. So basically, corporations, innovation within the core of the corporation, because they're designed to execute and do causal thinking, kills innovation. You guys know Steve Blank's work? All right. So Steve Blank is the father of modern entrepreneurship, and his work is maybe some of the most significant in business in the last century. So Steve is, Steve's teaching night school at Berkeley, a successful entrepreneur, teaching night school at Berkeley, and he says to himself, why am I teaching kids to do business plans? We never wrote a business plan. And so he starts thinking about this, and what he realizes is that what matters are customers. And so Steve develops called 4 Steps to the Epiphany, but also known as the customer development process. Steve does something really dramatic. He divides the world in half. And he says these first 2 steps of looking for a business model are what entrepreneurs do. We search for business models. Business people execute on business models, right? They're the experts. They have the recipe. They make that recipe incredibly efficient. They get all the ingredients done. They get supply chain, logistics, all stuff. It's amazing, right? What we do today with our big businesses. But we always treated entrepreneurs like they were just small versions of big businesses. You wrote business plans. You hired all kinds of sales people and marketing people and strategy. And we realized that was all wrong. Literally, we realized that was all wrong. This is a big deal to the world, and we teach this all over the world. We use it all over the world, this process and methodology. So basically, entrepreneurs search for business models, business people execute on business models. The impact within corporations is that this process of searching for a business model is a lot longer than the Hollywood movie. So a Hollywood movie takes about 2 hours to go from basically idea to flying on your own private jet and billions of dollars. In reality, this process takes a minimum of 2 to 4 years in my experience working with startups. And most companies don't have the patience to wait 2 to 4 years to see if any idea moves forward. So search, execution. This is one of the most significant contributions to our understanding of entrepreneurship maybe ever. And it's changed how we approach everything that we do and what we do. Joseph Schumpeter, the economist. So Joseph Schumpeter is considered sometimes the prophet of innovation, entrepreneurship. He's the first economist. So he's an Austrian economist, came to the United States, and he looks around the United States. He's like, wow, this is crazy. These entrepreneurs are destroying entire industries. I mean, whole industries are disappearing with these like startups, right? I mean, destroying entire industries. They're destroying the whole horse and buggy industry. These guys working out of garages making cars, right? And he looks around, and it's sometimes called the Mark I regime, but he takes from Karl Marx. The first part of his book, he gives both disagreement, but recognition to Karl Marx for his work. But he borrows from Karl Marx the idea of creative destruction. So creative destruction becomes a key part of entrepreneurship, and the lingo is that entrepreneurs creatively destroy industries and new industries are born. Fast forward, Schumpeter will look around and he'll say, boy, you know, all these big companies, Bell Labs and XPark and all this stuff, boy, we don't need entrepreneurs anymore. The company's got it. They got these big research labs now that can do innovation. Well, we know that wasn't right in the long run. And so I think this idea of a Mark III regime under Schumpeter is that because innovation is moving so fast, for those of you who are in corporations, and I work a lot with my friends in corporations, we're trying to find ways to work together. In other words, you guys have the scale, we have kind of the speed of innovating on business models. We're trying to find pathways to collaborate in this new world. So basically, entrepreneurs destroyed all the big companies destroyed entrepreneurs, and now I think the next generation is going to be much more collaborative in the work between startups and big companies to address the speed issue of innovation. I think that's all I have. Yep. That's it. Thanks. I talk really fast. That was probably like a 6-hour lecture. It covered all kinds of things. I just threw them all together, stirred them up.
I have to say, when we would go out to dinner or something, I was working for him, that was pretty much what I would get in the car ride. We were going over, so it was drinking from a fire hose 24/7.
Yes.
And I think when we were together, I think we probably were almost working 24 hours.
Yeah. We were doing some pretty interesting work. I work with NASA and all that kind of stuff.
So,
Yeah.
questions?
So I work in higher education, and they're talking about entrepreneurship all the time. We have the entrepreneur, even creating labs and entrepreneur labs. It feels a little made up. Like, can we force entrepreneur and innovation
No.
by saying this is a lab to innovate? And how do we support these people without it being like, okay, come to this class?
So I never get asked to speak at the same place twice. I had the same question at Marquette from an engineering professor, same kind of process. If anything can be taken from our history and understanding of this stuff, you can't, it's got to be authentic. In other words, you can't from the top down create anything. Just not entrepreneurship, anything, right? Whether it be music or anything, it's got to be authentic, right? And so it's got to kind of come bottom up. I think the lesson from places like Building 20 is that what you can do as an educator is create an environment, right? So this is a problem, especially, right, big schools, big companies, is they have a hard time letting the rules go, right? And that's the lesson we take, and that's why most startups start in garages, basements. There's no rules. They don't start within big companies, right? Google, Apple, Hewlett Packard, all garage startups. So, no, you can't turn someone into an entrepreneur. You can't create, but you can create an environment, but you gotta be willing, this is the challenge, right? In an institution, you gotta be willing to let go. And then let a bunch of smart people come together and let them work through things. There's another kind of famous place that I always was fascinated by called the Institute for Advanced Studies. Anyone ever hear of this place? So during World War II, kind of the Walmart of his time, passed away, he had no kids, and he set up this kind of institute outside of Princeton, in part because there was a cap on how many Jewish people were allowed into the Ivy League at the time. And so at the end of the day, this place would, because it was this space that anyone could go to, had no restrictions, it was open. Einstein ends up there, Freeman Dyson ends up there, all these famous physicists, mathematicians, and the modern computer is developed there. But World War II, they had no parts, they had to scrap things together, there was no rules, right? It wasn't controlled by anyone. And so I think creating the environment and then letting, if you will, the creative people have that reign is what you can do. So you can play a role, an important role, right? Universities have been involved in innovation all through the whole process, right? You look at places, major innovation centers like Stanford. They play a very active role. Thanks, good question. Yeah.
Can we call competition as innovation?
Can you do what? I'm sorry.
Competition as innovation is part of innovation. To compete.
So can you use innovation to compete?
When we are competing, can be considered as innovation.
Oh, when you're competing is innovation. So, you know, it's interesting, a guy who left Google a short while back wrote a kind of a long thing about why Google doesn't innovate anymore. There's a fascinating thing about competition, is that I think if you're looking at the competition, you're probably not doing entrepreneurship. You're doing more business execution. You're doing market analysis, competitive analysis. So when you look at effectual thinking and the kind of the difference, so if you look at an entrepreneur, a business person plans and they drive toward that plan. An entrepreneur doesn't do that because they create the future. In other words, I don't care what the competition is, I'm gonna create a whole new future, right? It's that kind of mentality. So it's actually a very interesting question around competition. I think as entrepreneurs, we don't think about competition. We think, I'm gonna change the world. I'm gonna do something so significant. And sure, right? I mean, if you, and you always do the classic, right? If Google looked at a competition, they never would have started, right? There's 100 and some search engines when they started. You can go on down the list. But they had some new vision of how the world and web would work and search would work. Yeah, so competition's an interesting question. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I don't know. I was head of the mergers and acquisitions practice. So my focus was on early stage tech companies. So I did a lot of securities work. So if you guys know something called Reg D, I did a lot of basically capital raise securities work from napkin through initial public offering. So, and then traditional transactional work, right? Stock purchases and asset purchase kind of transactions. So heavily on the transaction side. Yes?
Do you think innovation is exponential?
It depends. You know, it's a good question. If you look at general purpose technologies, I'd say the internal combustion engine was exponential. Electricity, exponential, right? A lot of things, too small. So I think if you get to those general purpose technologies, I'm waiting for the next big one to come along. Maybe it's AI or something of that sort. We haven't seen one in almost 100 years. But when they happen, right? I mean, you think about it. From Ollie Evinrude, and these guys are all sitting together, right, down in the 5th Ward. It was called the Industrial Complex. Ollie Evinrude, Davidson of Harley Davidson, these guys, they all like shared stuff together, and they were all working on the internal combustion engine, right? Threw it on bikes, on boats, and all this stuff. Yeah, I think you need something really big to get that exponential piece out of it. And as an entrepreneur, you're always kind of looking for what could be, right? Is it blockchain? Is it Bitcoin or crypto, right? You're looking for what could be exponential. It's a good question, actually. Yeah, interesting. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the collaboration between Northwestern Mutual and Aurora and the Innovation Center?
So I'm not at Northwestern Mutual anymore, but I don't know much about it. I don't know if I can really talk about it.
I'm just curious where it fits in with the overall Milwaukee entrepreneurship scene and startups.
I think it's back to the question up here. I think entrepreneurship starts bottom up. So Brad Feld, so I've been heavily involved in a group called Global Accelerator Network, big projects with Steve Case and the two founders of Techstars. So the top accelerator in the world, they create Global Accelerator Network. So Brad wrote a book called Startup Communities. And what Brad said is that startup communities are built from bottom up. And I know this from the tech community, people have a lot of angst when the corporations come in and start trying to control the tech space or the entrepreneurship space. Me personally, I run from stuff like that. I mean, it's counter to my existence that some big company is gonna suddenly be an entrepreneur kind of driver. It's kind of an odd feeling. So I don't know what'll come of it, but we know there's enough evidence to support that it doesn't start top down. It's always bottom up. Yes.
With your work with like incubators, have you worked with like maker spaces and co-working spaces that have like membership models where what's your?
So I've had a chance to visit and talk to guys like Tim Rowe, who runs the Cambridge Innovation Center, which is probably the most successful co-working space in the world, right? It's in Boston, edge of MIT campus, highest concentration of entrepreneurs in the world in that building. I'm not a real estate person, but where I've seen it work around the world, it's been heavily subsidized by a foundation or by incredibly wealthy people. Milwaukee has never had a hit with a co-working space, and goes back, and you may know Chris Kuhl with Cool Fusion during the dot-com era. We tend to have an abundance of real estate here, where I've seen it like Boston emerge, where real estate gets so expensive and entrepreneurs have to come together to share rent and space. Or like 1871, which was kind of contrived in Chicago, but they created a foundation to support it. If the entrepreneurs have to pay for it, especially today, so more so today than ever before, I can just work at home. I got high-speed bandwidth that costs me nothing, and I can go meet my friends at a coffee shop or wherever. I think it's harder, the model even today, than it's been in the past.
Do you think the collaboration of having all those people and working off of each other and bouncing ideas and?
Oh, I think that's a big deal. So I'm not a social, and Brian knows you can't find me anywhere. I'm not a fan of social media. And then I was at a conference a few weeks ago. The idea, look, we're moving so fast as entrepreneurs. We're learning so quickly when we go through Steve's process. You gotta be close together. So the guys at Institute for Advanced Studies, one of my favorite stories is every afternoon, Einstein, all these guys would get together and they'd have tea and they'd talk about the things they couldn't solve. Right? What they couldn't solve. And so that human interaction will never be displaced. I won't go off on another theory, but I met this Dr. Hirsch who runs the brain research group at Yale now. She used to be at Columbia, running the MRI stuff. And she's done some of the first brain-to-brain research ever. And I don't know, there's something about humans being in direct eye contact that we've developed over such a long period of time. So I think you can do stuff by distance, but never, at least my opinion. So I do think there's tremendous value in these spaces around that, but then it's how do you get the people there, which I've seen be a struggle in Milwaukee, is how do you get the people there? To be honest, in Milwaukee, if I have to drive more than 15 minutes, I'm out. Right, I mean, it's like part of the magic of Milwaukee. Yeah. So, good question, though. Interesting.
Bouncing off of what you were talking about social media, do you think that a lot of the innovation as far as like face-to-face contact or like people actually interacting with each other, do you think social media has had an impact on that? Because, I mean, that's something I've studied a lot on, but it's interesting that you say that, you know, face-to-face conversation, like you can't compete, you know, with text or email. Do you think that social media has played a big role in like the decrease in innovation?
That's actually a very interesting insight. So, my opinion is that when historians look back, social media would be considered one of the most destructive things that ever happened to humankind. There's a new book out. It's destroying literally our ability to have civil discourse. It's polarized people in this book, and this guy's mapped it out. I can't remember, he's a professor at Stanford, new book, mapped out. The polarization is so extreme. It's a lot harder for me to be polarized when I'm sitting with you, right? But when I'm anonymous or somewhere remote, I can say all kinds of things I'd never say in public, right? And so I think it's fueled a level of, and we've watched it just in the last 2 weeks, a level of hate and violence publicly. It's like, I don't know, what's the good of it? And then I'll take the other side, the pure distraction, watching the amount of distraction of young people. Look, we know all innovation, and the reason why it just happens that introverts tend to be much more innovative in general is because it requires deep reflection. It's not just shoot from the hip. It requires a lot of thinking and processing. And when you're interrupted about every 2 seconds, I forget the statistics, right? How often people check their social media. How could you ever have a deep thought? So I agree with you. I think it's disrupted innovation. It's disrupted society. I don't see a good outcome from it. This guy's book, basically, the theory is that all the big love fest that emerged from social media is a complete lie, in effect, and we're seeing it play out. I mean, I'm watching it in real time. In addition, throwing the distraction of people, it's like, right, and you walk across, go back to UW, walk across campus, everyone's looking at their phone. Oh my, you're missing blue sky, birds, your colleagues running into someone that may have a t-shirt on that's, hey, that's pretty cool. Do you guys know those? All that's gone. Yeah. So, if you haven't guessed, not a big fan. Yeah.
What if you have created Facebook? Would you delete it?
Me? Yeah. I would. Look, I made a decision kind of when I left the law firm. I was making a lot of money. It's like I left, and it's like it was hard, and I made a decision like, I'd rather do what's right than be rich. In other words, just the amount of negativity and impact that's happened, it's like, come on, folks, really? Is that all you can contribute? I don't know. That's me, right? The small part of the population. There's Noam Wasserman did research on entrepreneurs, most extensive longitudinal research that put me in a small group of probably entrepreneurs. And that's why I spend half my time on the social side, half on kind of more commercial side stuff. Is that, I don't know, you got all this talent and ability, you should do something good, and if you're doing something terrible, I don't know. Not for me. Good question, I think. After I just deleted Facebook.
Do you think that all the current economy is going on without innovation of good entrepreneurship?
Do I think they'll crash, in effect? So will the economies crash? So I didn't mention, so part of the prolific stuff that happened coming out of the dot-com era is a guy named Tim Kaine in the Kauffman Foundation got a hold of a data set we'd never seen before. It was basically age of company and number of employees. We'd never had that data set before. And what he found out is that all net job creation, this is the United States, we can extrapolate to anywhere, country in the world, all net job creation in the United States comes from entrepreneurship startups. So if startups walked off the field, we'd very quickly, within a few years, be in negative, basically, job growth. In other words, we'd tank. It's fascinating when you look at his models and the research, and you can't question it. Basically, we're negative. So old companies, and this is part of the theory that evolves, right, is that old companies drive toward efficiency, right? Older companies drive toward efficiency, which means fewer people, more technology and other things, right? Startups are highly inefficient. We hire tons of people because we don't have the resources and the ability. We just hire people. So that's why all net job creation, sometimes I put in the presentation when the economy crashed 08 or something like that, there was a lead article in The Economist, Entrepreneurs, Global Heroes. It was a story about entrepreneurs in Mumbai. And that notwithstanding the economy crashing, all these entrepreneurs were coming out to start businesses. And The Economist's entire, right, one of those big special report sections was about how important entrepreneurs were to that question. So yeah, I think it'd be, right, if entrepreneurs walked off the playing field, it'd be pretty ugly from an economic perspective. There wouldn't be any Facebook though, which would be good. Yes?
So with all these different projects you've been a part of, are you driven by the process or potential?
Potential. You know, Steve gave us the closest thing we've ever today have to a process in entrepreneurship. It's not a rigid process, but kind of the outcome, right? Whether it be working with the Young Enterprising Society or, you know, doing the VR stuff, like some sort of meaningful outcome in the end. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, please.
How to build an innovation team in an organization?
How to
build an innovation team
in an organization?
Like, what kind of creative behavior tendencies to be seen? Like whether the person always exhibit the greenhousing mode, or he should be expansive mode, or he is not exhibiting the or being a devil's advocate. So what kind of things we should see?
So, because I'm older, I worked at Anderson Consulting, which is Accenture. And when Accenture looked around, they said, who's our most successful partners? And what they realized is that it wasn't grade point, it wasn't where they went to school, it was how entrepreneurial they were. So they basically created an entire hiring process built around targeting entrepreneurial people. Fast forward many years later, I'm working with a young entrepreneur in Mass, and she went on to be very successful in a very short period of time. But she was shocked because she was a psychology major and she had an offer from Accenture. But it was right because they targeted that kind of personality. So I think you can try to hire those people. I think what you run into, which is the question around the space and everything else, is can you create an environment though for those people? Look, they don't last long in institutions. If you invite an entrepreneur into your house, I mean, it sounds really glamorous, but the reason why the near decomposability theory of Simon and these guys is built around evolution and cancer, right? Evolution, basically genetic mutations is the basis of evolution, but it's also the basis of cancer. So at the end of the day, if you want genetic mutations, boy, because you don't know which way it's going to go, this is where they propose that you keep it just outside, just in case, right? So this is a different group of people. In most organizations, I think have kind of eyes bigger than their stomachs that, boy, if I had entrepreneurs, wouldn't the world be great? But boy, they really need to assess themselves of what that means. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. And I think we're going to converge where these institutions and entrepreneurs are working more together, but the models haven't been baked out. I think it's one of the things that's going to evolve here over time. People are trying a bunch of different things. I'm still working with some friends on it. Yeah, interesting question. Thanks.
So we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
So at a lot of higher educations, like Concordia, entrepreneurship is something you can major in business. Is that something where you can take classes and become an entrepreneur, or are you more
Oh yeah, it's a good idea.
That's all the time.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's wonderful talking to everyone tonight.
No, go ahead, because I think we parallel the same thought.
Yeah, entrepreneurship is not something you teach, right? But that aside though, I mean, we do teach it, right? I mean, I was trained by Steve Blank at Berkeley. They do have entrepreneurship programs at Berkeley and Stanford and in the crew that was there at SED School at Oxford. So we do teach entrepreneurship, but it's very different than classical teaching of entrepreneurship, business plan writing and those kind of things. Is it a major? Probably not, but can you teach? So even if you don't become an entrepreneur, you can learn the process, the methods we use to do entrepreneurship. right? The search process and going out and talking to customers and things of that sort. You can do that. But I don't know, it's something that you ultimately, and I think you become an entrepreneur because you think you can change something or do something bigger or something of that sort. And that's kind of more, it's more of you're driven by something like that as opposed to a class or a process. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I got in trouble one time because I was on some TV thing and my professor friends reached out to me when I said you can't teach entrepreneurship. So I'm no less cautious today. Yeah, what's that? Oh, I said I only get to talk at places once.
Well, I'd invite you back. Can I
thanks.
answer that question too, if you don't mind?
Yeah, fire away. Dude.
So,
of course.
I have to admit, before I came, so if you don't know, I'm the new MBA program director who runs an entrepreneur program.
And a serial entrepreneur too.
When I actually was hired, and even afterwards, and when Marquette and some of the schools started entrepreneur programs, I was one of the voices in the community that said you can't teach it.
Yeah.
So I answered the same way Greg did. And on all honesty, standing before you, I still really do believe that. The caveat, though, is I'm trying to train leaders. And so that's really been my goal of coming here, so train leaders and seed you everywhere around, right? And we're talking about a holistic leader. That's why we talk about mind, body, and spirit. So if we can get those people into AT&T that took the entrepreneur classes here and think like that, at least understand, because I think it's important. I think Greg brought up a really good point that I've been part of many times, where I've been brought in as an entrepreneur, and the big companies say, oh my gosh, it's going to be great to have you here. And it doesn't take long to realize that I'm more of a cancer cell than innovation and a good mutation. You know, that you've probably been the same. So if you're trained as a leader, at least how those entrepreneurs think, it is a value, even if you go into the corporate world. There's also a lot of entrepreneurs that are entrepreneurs, but they don't really know it, right? Because they look at somebody who created a Facebook and they say, oh, I could never do that. Well, the reality is you don't stand day one saying, I can create a Facebook. You're really driven by a passion. You're driven by, I see something and I can change that world. And so you don't think of yourself as an entrepreneur. Matter of fact, it took years for me to say I was an entrepreneur. I just did stuff because it was interesting and it was really cool. And matter of fact, the phrase that Greg taught me was cool people, cool projects. And that's what I look for. I was not an entrepreneur. So I think they're important courses, right?
Very important.
And I think they are of value. But I also have to say, one of the things that Colleen and I are working on a daily basis is to revamp how we're actually teaching that, to bring in some innovative ways that we can extend. So we can find those entrepreneurs and we can bring them out. And we can find the people who can think like that and bring them out so those two groups can work together, because that's the real power, right? When you do have that innovation and you do that, the capital and all those resources, if we can find a way that they can work close together, we can have those breakthrough foundational innovations, which does change all of society. So they do have a place. We got that on film.
You can edit me out.
Right, as I'm walking him to the door. So it was great having you. No, I do appreciate it, and I have to tell you, this is not him performing for an hour. This is what he's like 24/7. He is really a gifted individual, and
Thanks,
it was such a pleasure. I learned so much from him and continue to. So
thanks, dude.
We're very fortunate to have him. So if you could welcome or give him a big round of applause.